started. So
Okay.
just thanks to everybody for tuning in today. My name is Tim McLean. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Commio, and super excited to bring Scott Navratil in here. Scott is in charge of our customer retention and growth, as well as one of the early folks over at Telly, which became part of Commio. It's been 3 or 4 years now,
Going
Scott.
on 4 years next year.
Unreal. Feels like
Yep.
yesterday. But great to steal some of your time. I know you're super busy. So Scott is here to help us, everybody on the call, myself included, get a little bit more information about this one-to-one consumer consent rule that the FCC has mandated. By the way, Scott, I guess a little surprised. I remember hearing about this a while ago, and I went back and I saw that the original FCC sort of, requesting comments was from almost 2.5 years ago. So
Hmm.
this has been brewing for a while. So,
Yep.
and now we'll get into it in a minute, but the deadline is actually hitting in a matter of weeks. So that's what brings us all together today. So why don't we just dive right in? So before we get into the actual content, just a reminder, this is being recorded. Everybody who registered will get a copy of the video. And as we go, please use the chat feature. I'll be monitoring that, and we want to make this as interactive as possible. Questions, comments, if you're doing something a certain way, if you have a question for Scott, let's see what we can get covered while we're all together for the next 30, 40 minutes or so. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So Scott, as you mentioned, one-to-one consumer consent is here. Not quite yet, but we're a couple weeks out, right? So
Yep.
what does this mean from a high level? Like, and how did this start? Like, what are they trying to accomplish?
Yeah. So it's a topic that's been kind of in a holding pattern since January of this year. I know you mentioned it was first kind of discussed a couple years ago. But I want to kind of preface the discussion with that if you're currently a Cameo customer, you're pretty much already aligned to this rule. I think there's a couple things outside of the carrier DCA ecosystem that you just want to be aware of. But I mean, we've been kind of practicing one-to-one consent for a good part of this year. You can't get a campaign approved, whether it's 10 DLC short code or toll free, unless you can prove one-to-one consent. So we've all kind of already aligned to it, and for the most part, this is, we're still kind of moving at a pretty good pace. We've made the accommodations that we need to make, and I think really for those who are coming into the system, right, this is kind of a shock, right? And we do, like a lot of other people in the messaging space, we have a lot of customers who are lead gen affiliate. And so I think this is going to be the most impactful for them. But really what it is meaning, so what's your question, right? What does it mean? It means basically that if you're a consumer and you opt in to receive a text message from a particular business, one-on-one consent means it's only that business can text you. That business cannot share your consent with a bunch of other third-party and affiliates for lead gen purposes. Kind of what it sums up to be.
Gotcha. And I think this was an answer to, we all know that unfortunately our phones tend to be overwhelmed, swamped with robocalls and robotexts. And this is one more way the FCC is trying to help us take control as consumers of who can reach out to us legally, right?
Right.
Which makes sense. Makes sense.
Yeah, it's like when you go to a website and you want to do business with a particular company, you want to place an order for a product, and you're like, hey, I want to consent to receive text messages because you're expecting to get updates on shipping, the product status, order status, etc. And then, like literally within hours or a day later, you're getting a bunch of text messages from companies you've never heard of for
Yep.
products you had no interest in, right? And you're like, your phone's going off, and you're like, where did this all come from, right? So I think,
Right.
and that's the problem is one company got your consent, and then they basically shared your consent with a bunch of other affiliates and or other partners
Yeah.
to them, and they got compensated for that data,
Yep.
right? So that's really what we're
Yep.
trying to stop here.
Yeah. So they're trying to curtail. Absolutely. So again, so let's answer the question, what is it? And again, you always hear this four-letter acronym TCPA. May have
Mhm.
heard of CTIA, everybody out there, but these are the organizations that sort of set these rules, and there are laws in place. So the TCPA basically states, as we say here, that now you have to have prior express written, which also means digital, or e-sign consent before you can market to somebody, right?
Yeah, TCPA is federal law, right? It's very important that if you're in this business and you're using text messaging for business communications with your customers, it's very important that you really understand what TCPA is. We can provide links to their site. We can go read the document. There's some very specific rules that you need to be aware of. Um, Depending on your volume and the type of use case that you're in, it's also highly recommended, since it is federal, that you consult a telecom attorney who really understands
Yes.
TCPA. So first and foremost, like what we're talking about today, right? This is more informational. We're not providing any legal advice. I think you have that in one of your
Yes.
bullet points somewhere. But be very familiar with TCPA. Tim, you also mentioned CTIA.
Yeah.
I think every time we talk about compliance, we always bring up those two topics, right? It's very important you understand that. And then the third thing is understanding that the mobile carriers control the messaging ecosystems. You need to be very familiar with the carrier acceptable use policies, AUPs. If you want to just pick one, go pick T-Mobile's. It's probably the most strict. And I think if you can align to T-Mobile's, you should be okay with all the other carriers. But compliance starts really with you. You got to make sure that you or someone on your staff is very familiar with these rules. And so as we go through TCPA, there's a lot more to it, but right here it is providing written consent from a consumer to send them a text message or call them on their phone.
That's right. And we'll show some examples of this, guys. So don't worry about this language per se. But again, in the consent that the consumer is giving to you as a business, you have to really tell them, what brand is communicating with you, what type of communication are they consenting to? Like you already mentioned, like order, receipts, right? It
Mhm.
could be marketing, it could be something different, but you're actually telling them you're only opting in to this brand to receive this, and you also have to make sure that you're recording the customer's signature or opt-in in compliance with this e-sign act.
Yep.
So we'll go through those in a
Yep.
minute. So
Yep.
we're sort of stepping through. Like now we understand the lay of the land. And again, it's
Yep.
mid to late January when this kicks in for real. So, and what does this consent apply to? So we've got the list here. And obviously they're trying to combat uh, telemarketing in the form of, robocalling and robotexting. And obviously also messaging campaigns or robotexting. So it's both of those things covered, right?
That's kind of that's why we're here.
Yeah.
Is really because like I just described, right, is basically a brand, a lead gen, or an affiliate company, or performance marketing company. It could be any business, honestly, sharing mobile subscriber consent with third parties. That's kind of why we're here. But the way the rules apply today is that, and especially with the mobile carriers, is that you need consent for anything. If you're going to send them OTP 2FA, you're going to send them account alerts and notifications. There's going to be promotional marketing. I mean, there's probably 24 use cases. And so the way the carriers, DCAs, and honestly, everybody sees this as that you need consent regardless of the use case, right? Or the type of message that you're going to be sending them. So we're going to be getting into that a few slides later. And to be honest with you, I think this is one of the biggest challenges companies have had is acclimating to the fact that you have to disclose every type of use case and how many messages and what type of messages. And
Yeah.
you need to be able to collect consent for each and every one of those. You can't just say, I agree to receive messages from this company and whatever they want to send me. Like you have like very, very specific. So we're going to get into that. And I think that's been very difficult for people.
Yeah. And Scott, John actually asked that question. He said, is there really any real differentiation between marketing and other types? And the answer is, yeah, absolutely. Like you need to,
Absolutely.
and
Especially marketing.
yeah.
Yeah.
And John, we'll show you a couple great examples of this, like where you can have sort of multiple paragraphs and being like, hey, you're going to get like maybe you're going to get the two FAs, but you're also maybe going to get marketing, but you got to call those out as two separate blocks, right, Scott? And we'll show that in a
Yeah, so
little
you
bit.
can't say, and that's the other part too, is you can't say, okay, like as a consumer, I agree, I want account related alerts, security notifications, OTP 2FA, but I don't want marketing. So you have to allow the consumer to pick and choose what type of
Right.
use cases or messaging content they're going to receive,
That's right.
right?
That's right. Yep. And by the way, we do mention here that the exemption is for emergency sort of alerts, right?
Correct.
Emergency situations.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep.
Kind of like, well, I don't know, kind of like E911, but you get the idea. Yeah, emergency
Yeah, I mean, it
communications.
could
Okay.
be local city governments. Most of it's going to be government related for the emergency alerts, but that's a particular situation where they don't have to get consent to send out. a public
Emergency alerts.
service.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right. And the politicians also have an exemption, right? For
Oh, of
election
course they do.
season. Sorry, just thought I'd bring that up.
Yeah, I still think yeah, that's a whole different subject. I think
It
we did a
is.
webinar on political messaging.
Yep.
And there's some loopholes in that, but they're not exempt, right? I think they're exempt from the do not call list, but they still need to have consent. So it's interesting, unless they're
Oh,
sending the
okay.
messages P2P versus A2P, but yeah, a whole different
Gotcha.
subject.
Gotcha. Yeah. We'll leave that one to the side. Now let's talk about penalties. So if January 27th comes and goes and you're not in compliance, what could happen?
Mhm.
Well, 500 to 1500 per violation. That's per text or per call. Yeah, adds up, right?
Yeah,
And
and and there's always been fines and penalties with pretty much anything that's related to the government, FCC.
yeah,
We've seen in the news about some of these huge fines, around artificial intelligence and some of the things that have been going on. So this is not new, and I don't want people to be scared about
right.
this. And regarding this, one-to-one consent. If everything that you're doing is in order, right, you should never be faced with this. However, since that is the TCPA, there is deeper risk than just to say carrier enforcement by Verizon, right? So that's why the stuff that we're doing, you have to make sure that you're aligned to it. But as Tim, we were talking about before we went live, I mean, you really have to mess up to be, to get in trouble for getting called out for, this opt-in, this one-to-one option thing.
Yeah,
Um, you know, and I think we have I think there's another slide on this too about the TCP litigators, right? We'll cover that. I think there's a couple areas where you're going to have more risk, but I mean, as long as you're following compliance, if you're getting campaign approved, your campaign's approved, and you're sticking with the approved use case, you should be just fine.
yeah. And by the way, we do mention here that it's not just this new TCPA federal rules. A lot of states have their own individual laws and penalties,
Mhm.
and even the carriers. Obviously, we have a whole page of those up on our website as well that you could potentially run afoul of. And nobody wants to show up in a piece of litigation for any of this, and it's going to hurt your brand's reputation. So, what we're going to
Yep.
show you through the rest of the webinar is exactly how to stay in the in the lane and not run afoul of any of this.
I want to add just to that, Tim. So this
Yeah,
is if you're a business, you're a brand, and you are already getting your only messaging subscribers. You're the only one messaging subscribers who have opted in with your brand. This really is, there's a lot of good content here, but I don't think you're going to be as much risk as somebody who actually is actively participating in lead gen.
right.
Anybody who's in lead gen, affiliate marketing, obviously this is what this rule, it's targeting those type of companies. So they're the ones that really have to pay attention to this. But the other thing too on the state penalties, Tim, I'll get that to you. There is a whole list of states that have separate penalties above and beyond the FCC penalties for noncompliance, and so it's really important that you understand what those are. They're not all in parity. So certain states can have different penalties and different regulations for DNC and also for one-to-one consent. So you got to make sure that you're aware of, especially where you're marketing. And this is really where a good TCPA telecom attorney can help you, right?
Yep,
Understand what the risk is and how to navigate through that.
that's right. That's right. Well said. So you already mentioned who needs to care. You already mentioned, of course, the number one is our marketers and people that are doing any sort of list sharing between sister brands, lead gen, right? We mentioned
Mhm.
already, Scott and I are not telecom attorneys. We're just giving you some information. You should work with one. And I think last but not least is that, we've been saying this for a couple of years, Scott, but like, look, if you don't have one, 2025, depending on the size of your organization and what you're doing with communications, you should think about having a compliance officer, either part-time or full-time, to work with you one-on-one to look at how you've implemented all this to make sure you're in compliance with the latest rules. So
Mhm.
somebody on your team who really pays attention to this, because it's not a part-time, well, I mean, it could be part-time. Like you said, it depends. If you're already capturing that opt-in and you're going one-to-one with your customers and it's a very simple use case, fine, you know. But if you're doing anything sort of, near the edge, you got to be careful, right?
Yep. Yep.
And keep your team educated. Part of that is, hey, Commio, we do these webinars, we have ebooks, we have blogs that can help you. And by the way, we're also available. We have a new service where if you're already doing campaigns, go over to the website and sign up for one of our review sessions, and we'd be happy to take a look at your language, your landing pages, whatever it is, and give you the high sign from our point of view if you're in compliance with the way that we bring new campaigns online. So we're happy to eyeball that with you as well. So education is important. Um, so this is where it gets fun, Scott, right? A lot of bullets
Hmm.
here, but basically you have to track each consumer's consent, their opt-in, in writing, and these are all the different details. And I don't think we need to read all of these. I'd encourage you. And by the way, again, we'll provide the slides. You'll have this list after the webinar, but I think you get the idea that should somebody, like it happens, Scott, like I get a text and I'm like, I don't remember opted into this. And if I'm not having a good day, I might actually think about reporting them, right? Well, let's
Hmm.
say I did report them and that came all the way back around. Eventually, you may get a request for, all right, well, you texted Tim on this date and time. Show me how you captured his opt-in. And
Hmm.
this is the type of information that you really should be ready to provide about Tim, you
Yep,
know?
correct. And so there's a lot of, and so yeah, this is a lot of information to capture. If you're in the lead gen space or you're doing a lot of volume, especially in verticals that have the carriers have identified as like known spam campaigns, it's important that you clearly have a tight process for consent and opt-in. Now, a lot of those companies use someone like an active prospect who
Yep.
has trusted form, and it goes way beyond just capturing basic data. It actually can capture the subscriber physically, action adding a signature and checking the box. It actually captures that image. And that's really good, right? So, for a lot of people, if you're not doing lead gen and you're doing, healthcare and you're doing OTP 2FA, CPaaS, CRM type of things, you may not need to go to the extent of something like trusted form. It's always a best practice. It's always good to have. Now, the problem that I have, just I'll add that caveat or a caveat, is that a lot of people who use someone like Active Prospect and Trusted Form don't have immediate access to the data. So what'll happen is if you got an audit by a carrier said, "Hey, we need you to prove opt-in for Tim," um, they would give you that RCA, and then usually you have to respond within 24 hours. And what I've seen is some customers like, I've requested that information, and it can take several days to get that from their trusted foreign vendors. So something to consider if you're not doing millions and millions of subscribers. Try to think about a way to store this information yourself in the cloud and have it readily accessible to you. Um, so really important is just to be able to have this information and prove that you've actually you captured consent for the subscriber.
Yeah, and I'd say too, Scott, I really would pay attention to the bottom right here where, you have to delineate what campaign was the opt-in
Mhm.
provided for. Like, I think people originally would just say, oh, just check here and we're going to send you text messages. And then you
Yeah,
would just send them all kinds of stuff. And you're like, no, it has to be each unique campaign, right?
correct.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And that's one thing that if you've been messaging with us for a while or anybody, you've seen before, 2 or 3 years ago, you could say, I just consent to receive text messages from XYZ.
right.
Right. Now it's like you've got to, and you're going to show it in the next slide, you really have to start breaking down consent for each type of use case. You can't have your consent tied to privacy policy, mobile terms and conditions like it.
Yeah,
And so what's happening is for a lot of people who have web properties, now you're seeing all of this additional legal language and consent language being added to the bottom of their consent forms and to their privacy policies. And a lot of people are like, oh, it's too much.
yeah.
But it's you just got to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as a marketer, it hurts my heart every time I have to add a checkbox or an entry in a form
Mhm.
because it drives down conversions. But it is
Yep.
what it is. We got to
Yep.
do it. All right. Well, again, we'll provide this list and there's some more details coming up on this. But this is where the rubber meets the road, Scott. I think this is one of my
Mhm.
favorite slides in the deck is, and by the way, we're actually going to provide you guys with the text from these boxes to give you a starting point. So I
Mhm.
love that you highlighted here. Like the first checkbox is I'm opting in for account notifications and alerts. And the second one is you can choose whether you also want to opt in to get marketing promotions. So I can choose. And this is what this is really for,
That's really
right?
what they want, right? You want to give the consumer the option of what type of messages they want to receive. And so now if you have a brand and you're sending out like, let's say 6 or 7 different types of message, content, use cases, right? You could have 7 or 6 or 7 paragraphs that basically make the same statement.
Yeah.
One of the options that is acceptable that we've seen with a lot of the carriers is to basically have the standard disclosure. That's a disclosure statement. Everything that's in there is not filled. Like that is all required. If you don't have that language, number one, you won't get your campaigns approved. So it's important to have your disclosures, your how to get, what happened, how to opt out. And stop is the industry standard. We really recommend that. The FCC has, I think, 6 or 7 other keywords that you can use that are acceptable. We don't have them listed here, but we can provide that. I'd be like end, cancel. I actually have them somewhere, but we
Yeah.
can provide that later. And then you have your message and data rate, disclosure, your message frequency, super critical. You got to have that. And then there's this new thing that we've been kind of putting in or recommending is that provide my e-sign consent. The e-sign hyperlinks to the e-sign act, right, for digital signatures. It's just an extra step for compliance. So more on the front end side of this when you're actually trying to get your campaigns approved, showing that you're aware of e-sign in your disclosures shows the carriers that you kind of know compliance. You understand the rules and regarding digital signature and consent. So the other thing too is then the other option is adding, having that one consent or the disclosure paragraph, and then just having check boxes
Right.
for each type of message content that you're going to be sending. And so the key there is like as a consumer, I'm like, well, yeah, I want account alerts and I want OTP 2FA, but I don't want the marketing promotions, right? So I don't check that box. And so it means this brand can only send me alerts and OTP 2FA.
That's right.
So that's kind of what they want, right? That's what the carriers want. That's what the FCC wants, and that's what the subscribers want, the consumers.
Yeah. So I think it's easy if you're getting opt-in over a website, right? Somebody's
Hmm.
online, they're going whatever. But I love on the right. So we want to remind people that verbal consent is allowed, but there's some caveats. So
Yep.
whoever is actually taking that verbal consent has to verbally state all these disclosures, which by the way,
Hmm.
this happened to me at, was it Target or Kohl's over Black Friday? Somebody said, "Oh, would you like to opt in for text messages?" And I like a chump, I said yes, and they started to read this. They literally started to read this out loud. So
Uh-huh.
that's right. That's compliance, right?
Hmm.
By the way, it shocked me before we put this content together. I didn't realize that was a thing, but
Yep.
that's the way you have to do it.
Yeah, and you see this a lot. So verbal consent
Yeah,
is if someone calls into a contact center. I mean, every major brand's using contact
yeah,
center. Or if it's a point of sale, let's say you're at a hotel and you're checking in. Let's say that you're at a retail, like you were just describing at Target,
yep,
or even your healthcare provider, right? And you haven't gone to their website to check the box, and so they're going to say, "Hey, would you like to receive text messages about your order, about
yep,
your stay, or about your test results?" You're like, "Yeah, okay, great." Then they read the disclosure. Then the next part is real critical, right? So
yeah,
getting verbal consent is awesome. But you have to be able to document that. How do you document verbal consent? Right now, if you're a contact center and you're reading out that disclosure, hey, Tim, do I have your consent to send you a text message? You say yes.
yep,
Well, if I'm a contact center, I could actually have that call recorded, right? So if I got audited, I can log it and I can say, okay, well, here's the audio file, which is great of Tim saying yes, he agreed to receive messages.
yep,
If it's one of those other scenarios, right, this is where the double opt-in is critical. No, double opt-ins cannot have any type of marketing. You can't have a web link or, hey, save 20%, right? It's basically, and you still have to identify the brand and says, do you agree or do you consent to receive text messages from brand? Reply stop, reply, help to get help. You're just normal disclosures. And then there you say, reply with yes, right? And we
yep,
can give some samples. There's a streamlined version of how to get a double opt-in, but best practice is to have all the disclosure language that you typically did once you gave an opt-in confirmation, right? So, but once they respond with yes, that's your consent. You have that
yeah.
now in a digital form. You can store that data. I hope you're storing that data. And then if you ever got audited, you can provide the date that they responded with yes.
Yeah, and I've actually had it, Scott, where I've been on the line with a contact center and they asked me to opt in and I said yes. And then immediately I got the text on my phone, the double
Mhm.
opt in. So
Yep.
that was like perfect. They got the verbal and they did the double opt in real time. and they
Yep.
actually verbally said it out loud. Oh, yes, I see that you, thank you, you're now opted in. And
Yep.
by the way, last but not least, if you could focus your eyes on the bottom right-hand corner, you
Mhm.
have to maintain this record for 5 years.
5 years. It's crazy.
Yeah,
Yeah. So 5 years is what the expectation is of
yeah,
all of the consent audits we've seen. And you will get audits that go back, and they're not from last week. You can get audits from like 3 months ago. And
yeah.
most of the ones that we've seen are a lot older. I don't think I've ever seen one go back past, let's say, 6 months, but yeah, five
Yeah.
years is kind of the rule. And so, and if you're collecting a lot of customer data, that can be taxing on your storage, right? So you got to work with a partner who can do that, and then you got to also figure out, what additional costs would I incur to be able to store tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of subscriber consent or opt-in, right, for 5 years.
Yeah. And by the way, Scott, I got Matt, you're silly. Got an interesting question from Matt. He goes, "Hey, I'm building a demo environment. I'm only sending a text message to myself or colleagues for testing. Would that fall under the verbal consent clause?"
Yeah, testing. I think the funny thing is there is a use case for testing, low volume testing.
Ah, yes.
So I think the way it would work now, if you try to send a text message through a CSP like Commio, and then we would send it to the DCA, and the DCA would look up to see if that single text message was tied to an approved campaign, they would probably block it.
Uh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Matt's a smart. I know Matt. He's a smart guy. He knows what he's doing. He's just trying. He tried to throw a funny in there.
Hey, I want to add one last thing to that slide.
Oh,
Okay, so
please.
here's on consent. So here's another thing. It's best practice, right? So when a consumer or a subscriber, a lot of times the same thing, when they fill out your contact form, they opt in to receive a text message and they hit submit on the website. It's really now a best practice to send them a text confirmation that they've opted in to receive text messages from that brand.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Right. So,
Yep.
and now we're even seeing, I see it more on short code than I do 10DLC, but so anytime you have, and same thing with, so verbal consent, we just talked about the double opt-in. They say yes, then you respond back with your confirmation. Okay, great. You have been
Okay.
successfully opted in to receive messages from brand and all the disclosure stuff, right? But then on the forms, it's really important that that is something that a lot of people start building out. That's some additional technology, some additional code, but that's going to be more and more important moving forward. Just want to
Yeah.
add that.
And I think everybody knows too, whenever you're sending messages, you're going to have to make sure that the stop language is in every message, right? And make
Yep.
sure, and I say this every time, Scott, I just want to say it again. Like when people actually submit a stop back to you, you
Mhm.
need to process that as close to real time as possible within seconds. There are times where I'll send stop and I
Mhm.
never hear anything. And it's like to me, that's a warning flag, like
Yeah, the TCPA I think allows up to 10 days to process that, but I
wow.
100% agree with you. I mean,
Yeah.
once someone hits stop, you gotta reassure them that they're not going to get any more text messages. Most of the complaints and most of the enforcement and potential litigation you might see is because your stop stopped working. It didn't work.
Yeah.
So, you made a mistake. You sent a text message to a consumer who didn't have, or who didn't opt in to receive messages from you. You sent them a message. They reply with stop, right? If you immediately take them out of your list or you don't send them any further messages, it's probably the end of it. If your system doesn't work and you keep sending them text messages, what's going to happen is they're going to get more aggravated and then they're going to be more likely to complain to their carriers. Worse, and it's really bad if you got a TCPA litigator or someone else who's really got an agenda, they're going to pursue this legally. They'll go hire a lawyer or they'll file a complaint with the FCC. So it's really important that the opt-out really works. You have to test it.
Yep. Yeah. And I think we already covered this, but so we just said after they opt in, every caller message, you have to make it easy to unsubscribe
Mhm.
and, show evidence uh, immediately upon request saying that it's with your lead source isn't good enough, right? And then the list should be scrubbed to remove TCPA litigators. So, Scott, how does somebody get a hold of this list of TCPA litigators?
So it's a great question. The best thing to do is go out and find a company. I think Blacklist Alliance was one that I've used in the past someone who does this professionally. They give you access to all the DNC databases, including all the state DNC databases. They also have TCPA litigators and so forth, right? So these are people who are, in the business of, pursuing people for violations of TCPA law. And so, not to say that this is a complete, they have complete list, but what you want to do is use a company that constantly is accessing the databases, updating that TCPA litigator list, and then running your leads lists, right? The people you want to send these text messages to, or your customers list, right? You want to scrub it against these and remove anybody who's on the DNC. If a TCPA litigator number comes up, obviously, take that off your list. Don't send them a text message. So that's kind of, a service like Blacklist would probably help with that.
Blacklist. Okay. And by the way, just to call your attention to the screen captures here, I think this is pretty straightforward about how to make it easy to unsubscribe. Hallmark on the left is doing the right thing. There's a lot of space there between their lines, but hey, at least they say text stop to opt out, which you have to do. And you see on the right, that campaign was not doing it. So
Yep.
there's a good chance that would have been paused anyway because they're just not in compliance. And by the way, Dan asked a great question, Scott. So isn't Commio controlling the stop intent DLC and blocking within the Commio system? How does that work within
We
our
we
system?
have that mechanism in place as a safety net, and we do offer that for our customers. However, there could be customers that are, currently not using Commio, and so that's one of those things that if you're not using us, you got to make sure that your stop process works. Now, we still, even though we get a stop, if we receive a stop, we process it on our side, and we basically block messages from that source number that the message originated from, but we still pass the stop on to the customers, and so the customer has to recognize a subscriber opted out, so the customer has to remove them from their list.
Got it. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. And we have here basically when you think about these new rules, text messages are the same as calls, right? So they're both
Mhm.
subject to the requirements. Text messaging is subject to the same requirements as the do not call registry, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
Neither calls nor texts can go to someone while on the DNC list without express consent. And carriers, yeah, and we know that's a new rule as well that carriers need to block numbers identified as fraudulent as well. So
Mhm.
basically, if you think about it, sort of, people that are downstream from Commio, for instance, need to be ingesting the do not call, information and making sure that they're not violating. It's part of our terms and conditions. Like you need to make sure that you're scrubbing your list for DNC, at your end.
Absolutely, right.
Yeah,
Again, so if you're sending messages or phone calls to people who are on the TNC,
yeah,
the goal is not to make them angry and frustrated and motivate them to file complaints, right, or escalate, right? The goal is to just avoid it the best that you can. Update your list too. I mean, there's like I talk to customers like, yeah, we scrub our list against the DNC and TCPA and we remove non-mobile numbers. That's another big reason a lot of messaging campaigns, messages fail because they're sending them to landlines.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
but like, well, when's the last time you scrubbed the list? Oh, about 4 or 5 months ago.
Right.
The list can, I mean, literally can update daily. So at a minimum, I think, and there's also, it's one of those things you have to factor in the cost of doing this DNC scrubbing because it's not free through third parties. But the more often you can scrub it, the better.
Yeah. And by the way, Scott, take one step back here. So Devin asked a great question. He goes, "Look, if we include, the correct opt-in language, you're going to be contacted by this brand via automated means, blah blah blah, on our lead gen form. Does the first SMS that we send need to request an opt-in from the user to continue?" I would say that that's probably it would be a good practice to. It seems like to me that your first text after somebody opted in on a lead gen form would be to ask them to opt in, right? To confirm their opt-in, right?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
well, I mean, I guess you can say what you're asking for. That's the double opt-in. Do you
yeah,
agree to receive text messages from this brand, even though they just agreed to do it using the digital form?
yeah,
So that could be redundant. I think the confirmation is important. So the confirmation can be constrained as a confirmation of opt-in.
yeah,
And, oh, I didn't opt in. And then they would reply with stop. And then oh, okay, you've been opted out, right? So,
yeah. I've seen it.
I,
Yeah, I see. I've seen it, Scott, where I opted in on a website like it's Black Friday. Okay, I did a lot of online shopping, and I opted,
mhm,
and of course, what's the first thing that pops up? Oh, save 20% if you give us your cell phone number. I'm like, fine. So I punch
mhm.
it in. and it says, okay, you've opted in to get text. And what pops up on my phone instantly is, hey, you just opted in to get for brand X to send you marketing messages, basically reply with Y to opt in, right? And I
Mhm.
hit Y. And then it says, okay, you're opted in. So I think
Mhm.
that's another way to go, right? So you're sort of,
Yeah, I mean, so the double opt-in, depending on how you use it, I will always say that having double consent, is always a good thing.
yeah,
It's just extra proof that the consumer really did agree to receive the text messages.
yeah,
But I think, if you have a very solid capture form, you're capturing the data, it's all compliant, all the disclosures there, you probably don't need to have that double opt-in.
yeah,
So.
right. And by the way, Michael asked a similar question. He goes, if you require a double opt-in on form submission, do you still have to offer the e-signature on the form?
I think it is. So this is at that point. So it's kind of a pessimistic way to look at it. But if I always look, if you're in a situation, you have to basically go into litigation over TCPA violation, and you're sitting there in front of, the FCC, and you're having to plead your case, right? You want to be able to show that you made every reasonable effort, right, to be compliant, and you did everything to capture consent. Be very, very clear about consent. And so, I would say yes, that you want the you want the e-sign verification, and you want the double opt-in. The double opt-in is them responding with yes,
Yeah,
right? But the actual e-sign verification is their contact information, probably the IP address, all of that stuff that you covered. What was that? A dozen different data
yeah,
points,
yeah, yeah.
and them checking
All
a
that.
box and hitting submit, or ideally their signature, right? So that's what the
Right.
trusted form provides. So having the e-sign consent and a double opt-in with a yes is always going to be, it's always going to benefit you,
Yeah. If anybody,
especially if you're in lead gen.
absolutely. And if anybody on the call isn't familiar, just go over to Active Prospect and take a look at their trusted form solution. It's kind of the industry standard, right? And it
Yeah,
does all, it
we're not
covers all this.
compensated by them.
We're
We're not
not.
getting
No,
kickbacks from them.
right.
So, maybe we should. I don't know, but no.
No, 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 no. No. But all right, so let's talk about the websites, by the way. And Scott, I feel like my picture is turning blue as the sun is going down here in Raleigh.
Uh-huh.
But blue in the face talking about, look, your website, you have to update your website too. And it's all about privacy policy and terms and conditions.
Mhm.
So they're going to look at, like I know we do. We pre-vet this with our customers. We look at the privacy policy and the T's and C's and make sure that this language is present, right? And this is
Yeah.
the biggest sentence that needs to be in there is we're not going to share your opt-in consent with any third party for marketing or promotional purposes. And usually this is followed up with, but for law enforcement only. So if law enforcement contacts us, we have to, share the data.
Yep.
But other than that, you as the party sending messages, you are saying you're not going to resell or share the opt-in data with anybody else.
Spot on. This is one-to-one consent. This is what this is
Yeah.
all about, right? And
Yeah.
so, number one, you can't even get a campaign approved if you don't have this language in your
Right.
form. The other thing, and you brought up another good point, is I'd say probably 8 out of 10 reasons why campaigns are rejected is because they don't have this language. They don't even have a privacy policy, or they
Yeah.
don't have a terms and conditions with the disclosures. So
Right.
those are, you don't even get out of the gate if you don't have this stuff.
Yep.
And you mentioned that there is a lot of situations where a brand can share consumer information, right, with law enforcement, through a subpoena type of process.
Right.
They can share information with the platform vendor for their messaging, just to be able to transport the message, right? But it's not sharing their consent, or they're agreeing to opt in to receive text messages.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Exactly. That's right. Um, yeah. So that's all. Just and by the way, and again, we have this language. It's in our ebooks and our our content. If you need examples, we're going to provide them. So you just got to make sure that it's there. And again, and when you're spinning up any new campaign, it's the first thing that we're going to look at as a good vendor, but it's also the first thing that the DCAs are going to look at before they approve you. And I think, Scott, I feel like we used to do these webinars and it was sort of like 8 out of 10 reasons why the campaigns weren't kicking off quickly were because of something like this, right?
Yeah, yeah. Now, there's one thing I want to add to this, and this is very important, especially if you are in the lead gen space. So, how do you navigate around one-to-one consent, right? So, if you, let's say your, a company like Angie's List, or now it's called Angie or Home Advisor or Service Titan or so forth. I don't know if Service Titan does this, but if you're using like a brand that basically gets you contractors. So I'm going through this. I needed some work done, some concrete work done. And so I went to Angie's and I'm like, hey, this is what I'm looking for. Here's where I'm located. And I want to hear from local contractors that they've vetted, right? Or they recommend based on what I need done, right? Because I don't want to go out there and have to try to find and do all the research myself. There's a huge value to that. And I think most of the consumers want access to that type of service. And so under this new ruling, how does someone like Angie's get around that? So what you need to do, right, is you can't say, I'm going to take your consent. I'm going to go share it with a bunch of companies that we think, are going to be a good fit for you. The brand can basically send that information and send it via email. So then basically they could give, okay, this is this consumer's email address and they're looking for concrete lifting. And then so each one of those brands can email the consumer, right? And then of course the consumer can say, okay, well, I like this brand. I'm going to go to that brand's website. I'm going to consent to receive text messages that way, right? So
Uh,
you can get the information over via email, and then the consumer can go opt in directly with those brands. The other thing that you can do, and I think this is really gets really kind of ugly from a marketing standpoint, is that if your software was intelligent enough, you could actually quickly identify 6 vendors that would be a good fit for this consumer, and then you can basically list each one of those vendors on the consent form. So then as a consumer, I could say, oh, okay, well, yeah, here's 6 people and here's the consent form. Yeah, I'd like to receive a text message from ABC Concrete Company, XYZ Lifting Company. So I can pick and choose, right? I'm opting in and providing consent for each one of those brands.
hmm.
And then once I've opted in and given consent, then that Angie's List can provide that to those ones that I've opted into. Then in that particular situation, then those brands can send me a text message because I've already consented to
Yeah.
get messages from that particular brand. I just did it on Angie's site versus their site.
Yeah, and as the platform owner, they're the ones who would record that consent, right? That
Yep.
opt-in, and
Yep.
then provide it to their customers. Yeah. So it's all
Yep.
inside their ecosystem. That makes
Yep.
sense. Makes sense.
Yep.
All right. So again, this makes me nervous even having this slide in here, Scott, but lead selling and buying is still a thing, but it's gone way down since I think, we started in this industry. But there are some rules you need to follow if you're still in this space, right? So you
Yeah.
still need to, here's the list, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's still, and I think when we started with the registration process started and now with the one-to-one, and so a lot of lead gen companies like, it's just messaging, it's just a nightmare now. We're
Yeah.
all just going to go back to email. And I think a
Yeah.
lot of people did that, or social media or even print.
Right.
But we have a lot of, in fact, we have very large lead gen companies that use us, and they've been very like willing to make the changes that they need to make, right? Hey, if you want to continue to do messaging, you just have to, you have to make the changes, you have to play by the rules. And those that were willing to do that have now kind of navigated around it, and they're starting to ramp back up again, and they're fully compliant. The ones who haven't adopted or haven't acclimated to the changes, right, are quickly dying off. Like they're going back to other mechanisms, and they're not using messaging.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Sorry, somebody asked an interesting question. I was just replying in real time. Um, but yeah, I guess it wouldn't be too much to say though, Scott, that if you're still working in this space, that there's a lot of rules that you need to be really aware of here, and when it comes to buying and selling leads these days. And if you got to avoid, the biggest booby traps, right? So again, this list is kind of a good start, but again, it's like the onus is on the brand doing the telemarketing or the
Correct.
texting. So
Sorry. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like if you're buying a list or you're somehow participating in this space, you got to remember that whoever is the one that ends up doing the communicating is the one that's going to be on the hook. And we've already
Yeah.
seen big penalties. We've seen lawsuits already go through for some of this, and
Mhm.
it's just people who just look. We all know it. We're running a business. We're busy. We don't want to spend the money. The compliance is can take time and it takes money. But if you're playing at the edges, you got to be careful. Um, anyway, um,
Yeah, well, it's a really good point. I think that's the thing. If you're using a third party and the third party has a breach or they have a failure and all your data's gone, and you
Yeah,
then you get
yeah,
audited, right? What do you do?
right.
So be redundant, right? It's a fantastic concept is, use a cloud service like Active Prospect, but also find a way to capture the data yourself, right? And make
Yeah,
sure that they're in parity.
yeah. And by the
Um,
way, yeah, I'm sorry, Scott. Somebody just had Zach had a great point. He goes, you guys just mentioned email twice. I'm guessing that email is outside the scope of this presentation. It is. It
yep.
is. Email's different. I don't want to say that email's more lenient. Maybe it feels like it's more lenient, but you better make sure if, and by the way, as a marketer, I absolutely live and die by this. Like, I'm going to be pretty generous with who I email, but you better make sure that the unsubscribe at the bottom of your email is super clear and it better work and it better be instantaneous. Like, because
Mhm.
there's also people that have been fined millions of dollars for email campaigns too.
Yep.
So and that you're right. It's a whole different presentation. It's a whole different thing. But the rules for texting now and calling have definitely, I would say, I think you'd agree, Scott, they're more onerous than email, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because this messaging is more personal.
Yeah,
You know.
for sure. For sure. And by the way, John's already mentioning he just went to look at active prospect in real time, and apparently they're missing some of these disclosures on their opt-in form.
Are
So
they? Yeah. Yeah.
remember, what was the other company that has red and white in their logo that their sign-up forms were also
Oh
not
my.
compliant?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
started with a T. I don't remember. I don't know. They
Yeah.
sounded a lot like
Yeah.
Commio. Okay, that's all I'm going to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
Come on,
Yeah.
guys.
It's
Like
amazing
T.
to me. It really is. And I think, and
Yeah,
I mentioned Angie's List. I went through that exercise and
yeah,
there's a lot of people and you think they're huge. Like they are the biggest brand. I mean, this is a
yeah.
lot of people are behind the ball. Angie's is behind the ball. And I got text messages from people I didn't opt into,
Ouch.
And I think, but it was services that I wanted. So I kind of looked past it, right? But that's
Right.
the concern is that when I'm getting text messages from brands I don't want to receive text messages from, then I'm a little more, focused on,
Yep.
stopping it.
Yep.
So
Well, and sorry, I'm going to repeat myself, but I already said earlier, like every once in a while I get texts from people I don't recognize. That's fine. Because when I hit stop, you better immediately unsubscribe me. And when you don't, that's when you run the risk of the wrath of Tim,
yep.
and the rest of your
Yep.
customers. All right. So, all right, let's talk about using it to your advantage. And I agree, like this new way of approaching one-to-one consent really, it shows that you respect the privacy of your customers. You're ethical, you're reliable, you're up to date, and I'm happier as a customer. If all your stuff just works, like I'm good, I'm more likely to do business with you. I couldn't
Mhm.
agree more. Could not agree
Yep.
more. Oops, and looks like my hour pause here on my notifications just ended. Sorry, guys.
We're
All
almost
right.
there.
Yeah, we are. So some tools. I think we already mentioned Active Prospect. There's other ones that can capture that opt-in piece that you can embed in your website, an iframe or a trusted form. They've been out in just a couple Google searches, you'll find a lot of these. We know who they are as well. We're happy to consult with you on how what it is you're trying to accomplish and some of the vendors that we've seen work very, very well. And obviously, Active Prospects has been around forever. And
Yep.
I mentioned earlier that we have a smart review, a free smart review that we can do with you. If you just go to the website, there's a form. Look underneath our menus there, and you can actually sign up to get a smart review. And that'll literally be like a 15-minute conversation with our team. And we'll just take a look at your opt-in language, your privacy policy, your terms and conditions. We'll do that quick spot check that we do when people sign up to start a new campaign. It will give you some tips to make sure that you're in compliance or potentially not, to at least go back and make sure you're well aligned. And we'll also provide in the follow-up to the webinar a link to our messaging registration checklist, which Sherry, I see you, Sherry, our content like person. I think, do we update this every week or every other week? We update it a lot. There's always new things to add to that checklist.
Mhm.
So we'll make sure you get a copy of that, and we'll remind you if you sign up with us when it gets updated as well to make sure
Yeah.
that
I,
you're
I like to add to that one slide too,
yeah,
is that the Commio customer service and knock and the account
mhm,
management team are very well versed in compliance. And so, when you're, I'm not going to be the one that's, looking at each one of those, those brands or those campaigns that have been, received for smart review. So, I think it's important, right? It's not to have just one person on your team who is, you need to have someone dedicated to compliance, but then you need to educate the rest of your staff, your
Yeah.
CS people who are writing your content. We find that all the time that, whoever's drafting your messages, right? No one's really paying attention to the content. There's typos, there's grammar issues. They miss the compliance components, brand identification, opt out. And so it's really important that the people who are actually, who manage this part of your business, they also understand compliance, right? So you want to make sure that as many people in your business that are tied to the messaging and the phone calls understand this and that they're very well up and that they're updated too. Like I think you just said, the changes happen almost weekly, right? A carrier changes something or the FCC changes something. So it's important to stay on top of it and make sure everybody on your team is aware of those changes.
Yeah. And Scott, I'm not sure if we're equipped to answer this question, but Zach was asking, well, so we've talked about text messaging and robocalling. Well, more like robotexting and robocalling, right? These are A to P, application to person communication
Mhm.
channels. That's what all the stuff we talked about applies to.
Yep.
Email falls to another side of it. It's a different compliance regime. Same thing's true for cold calls, right? Like if you have a call center picking up the phone and calling somebody, like if you already have somebody's information, like, what about the consent for calling? Like, do you have to ask them on like, I feel like again, that's kind of out of the purview of this webinar.
I'd say, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
from the FCC's point of view, call messaging is just like phone calls. Phone calls, it started with phone calls, messaging got added to that. So I think all of this applies, right? So,
Yeah.
if you're, and the thing about like on messaging, right, is that so if you are going to be doing, phone calls or cold calling, you should have a consent form. I agree to receive phone calls or, sent from an ATDS, right, automated telephone dialing system, to my mobile number above, right? So having their consent to actually phone call them or robodial them is important, just as important as the messaging.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, this doesn't apply to one-on-one calls, right? Like if somebody has a pre-existing business relationship, you're allowed to
Correct.
call them. But as soon as it becomes automated and as soon as it's, something that potentially would require, if it's a sales call in particular, you really want to make sure you get that opt-in.
Yep.
Makes perfect sense. All right. Well, Scott, thank you for a whole bunch of your time today. I think this
Of
content's
course.
great. And again, Commio is already following all the rules. We've been doing it for, oh, I would say almost this entire year to be prepared for this deadline. So I think it's making headlines now, which is why we did this webinar, just to give you guys an idea of what you need to be doing on your side. Again, we encourage you, if you go through this process, if you have questions, you need, copy for it, for these different disclosures, we're going to provide all that in the follow-up to the webinar, in the email as well as in our ebooks and other documents. And don't be shy about requesting a smart review. If you've made a whole bunch of changes and you're like, yeah, I think we're good, I'd like to get a second set of eyes, go to our website, sign up for the smart review. We'll put a link to that sign up form in the email. Let our team eyeball it for you, whether you work with us or not. We're not saying you have to do business with us, but we'd like to be, we're always trying to be part of the solution for compliance in particular and making sure that customers and everybody in the ecosystem are doing the right things. Oh, John just put in another question, Scott. He said, how would one deal with somebody who is on the do not call list but wants to opt in to receive marketing SMS?
It's a great question. It happens
Yeah,
a lot.
yeah,
I would say to take those ICP or ICB and reach out to that customer, probably via email, and just get get double out to get very clear consent that even though they're on the DNC, they are agreeing to receive text messages from that brand. So it doesn't sound like something that you would do just through your boilerplates on your website. It would have to be, you'd have to reach out to them and do it through another channel.
Oh,
That's
interesting.
the way I would
Okay.
do it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's where this really gets crazy. Like, I feel like, I don't know if you agree, Scott, we're uh, uh, sort of going beyond the purview of our known facts right now, but it feels weird that we have to apply the do not call list to also be a do not text list because I want texts and I don't want calls.
hmm
So I feel like that's a little bit of a gray area that the FCC maybe doesn't fully understand. It's like we need two lists. We need a do not text and a do not call.
And I think that that's coming. I think that there
Yeah.
will be a do not text list in the future. But the DNC, the do not call list, I mean, so many of the complaints come from that, people not scrubbing the list. And so I'd say just
Yeah.
to be safe, if you're, one of your customers or one of your contacts slash leads is on the DNC, remove them, get them off. Don't even take the
Yeah.
chance. You could, if you have their additional contact information, and they did opt in, you could send an email saying, hey, you opted in to receive text messages, but we show that you're on the do not call list.
Right.
Do we have your consent to send you the text message, even though you're on the DNC list?
Right. Right. Yeah.
That's how I would probably do it.
Fun time, Scott.
Yep, good stuff.
Well, yeah, and thanks again, everybody. I know we went a little long, but for all the right reasons. Again, watch your inbox for a follow up from us. And if we don't talk to you in the meantime, happy holidays, Merry Christmas. Hope everybody's setting themselves up for some time off here at the end of the year. And we're here at Commio to help you with your voice, with your text messaging. We've got some exciting new products coming out in 2025. Branded calling is in development right now, as well as a more full CPaaS solution inside of Commio.io. So a lot of really cool new things coming
RCS?
from. Yeah, yes, I'm sorry. I didn't mention RCS.
Yeah, it's a branded call. RCS
Yes,
is a big one.
sorry. It's funny because my brain is like, well, we've got the new way to take a phone number and secure it and make it a trusted asset. And then that leads right into RCS, where it's a whole new way of doing texting. So we've got a lot of education to do, a lot of new things coming in the year. And I couldn't be happier as a marketer to have lots of new things to talk about. So Angel, you're welcome. Absolutely. A lot of thanks for the content. And you'll get more invites after this from us for follow on as things change, as they will in 2025. As we know, we got a whole new regime coming into Washington that always changes things. So watch for the FCC is going to turn over too, right? Like Scott, we never know. We never know where it's going to go. It's either going to get more restrictive or less restrictive. So we'll keep an eye on it and we'll keep you guys apprised, and hopefully things will change for the better. So Scott, thanks again. And thanks for everybody for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Talk to you soon.
Building amazing experiences that engage and delight your customers is easy with Commio. Our smart, reliable voice and messaging solutions are easy to implement and scale with you, so you can deliver more calls and texts, be more competitive, and save money. With Commio, you get peace of mind and happier customers. Find out why thousands of software platforms and enterprises trust Commio with their communications. Get a demo today.